Okay, our next speaker, in addition to having a farm and raising Icelandic sheep, is also the professor of law and a professor of law and the Nancy Heathcote Professor of Property and Animal Law at the MSU College of Law. Prior to joining the law faculty in 1976, Professor Favre was practicing attorney in Virginia. He's written several articles and books dealing with animal issues, including such topics as animal cruelty, wildlife law, the use of animals for scientific research, and international control of animal trade. His books include Animal Law and Dog Behavior, Animal Law, Welfare, Interest, and Rights, and International Trade in Endangered Species. He's a national officer of the Animal Legal Defense Fund and of the ABA Committee on Animal Law. He has served as interim dean of the Law College from 1993 to 96 and from 1999 to 2000. He teaches property, international, environmental law, wildlife law, and animal law. And he is here today to talk to us about animal welfare, a historical professor. Please welcome David Favre.
Good afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here on this cold and windy day.
With pigs?
I've shared the stage with a number of animals over time, but this is the first time it's four-legged ones. They're really cute. Hi, guys. He knows a good lawyer when he sees me. If you need to stretch or something in place, feel free. My one commercial is through the law school. I have a website that is perhaps the largest in the world dealing with animal law. All of the laws of the United States pretty much are there, and we have a little side part of it for veterinarians with some veterinary law there as well, so you might look that up. Today I've been charged with introducing you to the historical roots of cruelty law. I think that you will find that actually interesting because it gives us full information about what we're doing today, what our current cruelty law represents. It goes, the lineage of language through the law is very clear, and I think that you may find this instructive to understand better what we have today. One more. That's a bowl of Icelandic lambs. They're about a week old, and they just like each other, and they put themselves in feeding bowls all the time. Here's a quote from 1809. Lord Erskine, in the Parliament in the UK, was for the first time in Western civilization, I can't speak for Eastern civilizations, for Western civilizations asserting that there should be a law to focus upon the welfare of animals. And I think he very much represents the public view of the time, which is pretty much still the public view. This is a Judeo-Christian background, accepting the position that animals can be used by humans, but that they should not be used unnecessarily. They should not be abused. This idea, and it also follows along the idea of the Christian view of the Good Shepherd, that you have a flock, you have responsibility for a flock, you must take care of the animals in your charge. He didn't succeed in 1809, but by 1822 he came back and they got through another law, and here they got through the first law, and here's the language from the law, and we'll talk about what some of these words mean as we go through this. Wantonly and cruelly beat or ill-treat any horse, mare, gelding, mule, ass, cow, heifer, steer, sheep, or other cattle. Fine of not more than 5 pounds or less than 10 shillings. 5 pounds would be a lot of money back then. Nor imprisonment not exceeding 3 months. 3 months imprisonment represents, in our lexicon today, it's a misdemeanor. It's not a felony, it's a lower class crime. And that historically was true in the United States as well. Okay? Notice, of course, the specific listing of animals. Those are the only animals that counted politically at the time, the only ones they could get protection for. Now let's flip to New York. This actually is from Detroit, but we can pretend it's in New York. And we have to take our heads back to what was urban life like around the time of the Civil War. Okay? It has nothing to do with the Civil War, but what was urban life like? And the answer was, it was driven by horses. They were everywhere. I saw one count that said for the city of Detroit there are 10,000 horses in the city at some point. They are the automobiles, they're the trucks, they're the auto carriers, they're everything. Okay? So if you wanted to move something, it was by horse. Now also consider the fact that at this point in time, there was no protection for that horse. You could do whatever you wanted or didn't want to do to that horse, and the law had nothing to say about it. So if you got tired of a horse one day, you could just unharness it and walk away. And that's what was happening in New York City. There was a lot of abuse of horses that were readily visible to every person that lived in New York. They knew about it. They could see it. There's another one. Does it show? Can you see the ribs on the horse there? Really distinct lack of appropriate care. You must understand the nature of the law in that it represents a minimal standard of conduct acceptable within that particular society, the society that makes the law. Okay? So we have religious views, we have ethical views, we have all kinds of individual ideas about how to think about animals. Pets, horses, swine. Another thing that we want to be aware of as we go through the language is that criminal law has the capacity to focus on whether or not you have a general intent or a specific intent in what you do. And if it requires a specific intent, then it's harder to get a conviction. A specific intent means that they have to show that in your head you intended the consequence of what you did. A general intent is you did what you did. I.e., if the law says if you inappropriately shoot an animal, a general intent crime is if they can show that you had a gun, you fired the gun, you fired it in the general direction of the animal, and the animal was hit. Guilty. The law could be written, however, if a person intends to and does in fact carry out the shooting of an animal without justification. Intends to. That means the prosecutor has to show beyond a reasonable doubt that in your head you meant to shoot the animal. Okay? Which is always harder to show what's inside somebody's head. How about that for all? All these pictures are from the Michigan Humane Society. And their book that they have of the history of the Michigan Humane Society has a lot of fascinating information. Okay, to look at a statute, what we're going to do is look at language and see how the language evolves. I know that sounds kind of dull, but hang in there. All right? Here is some of the questions that help us understand that language. Which animals are protected? What human motivation is an element, if any? What action is covered? Is the language to be judged in a social context before it's illegal? More on that. What level of punishment does it reflect, and will the law be enforced? With animal laws, it is often the case that the law is way ahead of enforcement of the law. We've gone through in Michigan and well, every state, the cruelty laws became tougher, more extensive, more protective, but the prosecutors in all of the counties in Michigan weren't on board yet over the last 30 years. And it's just over the last 10 years that I've seen prosecutors begin to take that language seriously. So whether or not it's going to be enforced is a very, I'm not going to spend too much more time on that because that's more of a political and social question. Okay, here's some language from the early 1800s, before the Civil War. This is a fairly, we'll call this an intermediate step. Okay, look at the top part. I've got parallel things in different colors. It's illegal. Every person, the bottom says will be guilty of a misdemeanor. Every person who shall, 1, maliciously kill, maim, wound any horse, ox, cattle, or sheep belonging to another, shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. And then part 2 is maliciously and cruelly beat or torture any such animal, whether belonging to himself or another, is a misdemeanor. That's a really interesting break that they have here, because the top one is protective of the property interest of a person, i.e., if you hurt the animal, the crime is that you've hurt somebody else's animal, because it says of another. Okay, so if you kill another person's horse, then you have violated this law. Right? But the second part opens up the idea that you may have a duty to the animal that you own, not just to somebody else's. Okay? And this is getting to the critical divide that we had in society and property law, and that is, can we have a law that focuses upon the interest of the animal as opposed to conforming the conduct of the human being? What is our focus here? Are we worried about humans doing bad things, or are we worried about animals being ill-treated? Those are two different roads you got to go. And this one shows us where the break has occurred. Because you notice that not the same acts are in those two things. Kill, maim, or wound any horse belonging to another, but down below it's only cruelly beat or torture. So what the protection that your animals get from this is a small window, right? First of all, it has to be a specific animal. Notice dogs have no protection whatsoever. Cats are not mentioned. These are commercially valuable animals. And in the eyes of the law, if it didn't have commercial value, then why would we be talking about it? Right? That's all the law was really caring about then. And at this point in time, they didn't care about children either. There are no children protection laws either. None. Zippo. Okay, so it's not inconsistent. Now, the other thing that you notice is that the word malicious is the adjective described in both categories. It's not illegal to beat your horse. It's illegal to maliciously beat your horse. Okay? Or cruelly beat. Malicious has what? It has a subjective component to it. You have to have a certain intentionality to be malicious. And if you're a prosecutor, you have to convince the jury that the actions were malicious. Okay, so we have a limited number of animals. It takes a very specific intention. And we have a limited number of things that the law is focused upon. This is Henry Berg, founder of the ASPCA in New York. He is truly unique. He is the focal point. He is the catalyst that changes everything for the animals in the United States, in the whole United States, and indeed you could say in all of the Americas. Because he came back from touring England and Russia and some other cities. He's a gentleman. Now that meant something in the time of 1865. That meant he had money. And he was out and about trying to figure out what the hell to do with his life. And he came back committed. He talked to the people in England that had formed the RSPCA, the Royal Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, and saw their original act that they had there. So he sort of got informed about this and focused on it. And when he came back, he immediately turned to the idea of creating a law in the United States and in creating the nonprofit organization we now know. He's not a lawyer. I don't know the name of the lawyer that drafted the law that got passed, but I know it was his political standing and acumen that must have been required to get it through. It's a very simple law. I'm only going to show you some pieces of it. It has 10 sections, fits on one page, and is basically the father of all of the cruelty laws in the United States. This is 1867. He had to start one in 66. 1867, this law was passed. Again, another horse, general urban road, horses everywhere. That picture is probably an image that existed in everybody's mind at that point in time. Now think about the difficulty of going to a state legislature in 1867 to get a new law through. I mean, politics are still politics, right? You still have to convince these people who don't care anything about animals or know very little about animals to do something new and daring. And no other legislature had done this in the U.S., so this is kind of... But the idea of working horses until they fall in place was something they'd all seen. And I think that there's a revulsion to that. It's not fair. It's not appropriate. Yes, horses should be able to pull wagons for humans, but we humans shouldn't put them in that place. Okay, so the idea of being responsible for the animals is the driving force here. And well, I'll show you the language. Okay, I have the prior language above, and then the big text gives you the new 67 rule. Oh, I don't have... they're right before that word, torture, is the word overdrive, overwork. So when they drafted the legislation, the first act that was made illegal was to overdrive an animal, which can only be horses. Right? So it was constructed in such a way as to get the sympathy of the legislators, so it would get passed, obviously, by focusing upon that which they knew, which was horses. Go to the green, and in this law, there is no statement of ownership. It is irrelevant who owns the animal. And this is the flip to where I feel comfortable in saying we first looked at and we're concerned with the well-being of the animal, regardless of its property status. So whether it was a wild animal, your neighbor's animal, it didn't make any difference. This law was going to apply across the board, which is just what our laws do today. Unless you're in Texas and New Hampshire, and then you're allowed to torture wildlife. Torture, torment. Another thing about the law that you might not be totally aware of is that it's most comfortable in telling you what you should not do. Okay? Historically, laws are a list of things that you shouldn't do. And so we shouldn't torture or torment. But he wanted to get something in there about duty to provide something. In other words, that you have an affirmative duty to do something, to provide for the animal, if you have care of an animal. All right? So they've slipped in deprive of necessary substance. What of course, what they would want to really say was to provide necessary substance, but they couldn't do that in the lexicon of the time. They had to slip it into the negative like they do all the other criminal laws. So it's a prohibition. It's illegal to deprive of necessary substance an animal, or to unnecessarily cruelly beat, or to needlessly mutilate or kill any living creature. That's the other breathtaking change. Any living creature. I mean, think about that. Do you think New York Assemblyman in 1867 meant octopus? No, I don't think so. Do you think they meant snakes? No, I don't think so. I'm pretty sure in their mind the word animal and mammal were identical. And when they were thinking about animals, they were thinking about horses and four-legged animals. But he got through any living creature. So again, a major seismic jump shift in the law, which will be replicated over time in all the other states. Now, we don't say that today because the legislators are a little bit sharper and the mosquito issue comes up, and we don't want to get stuck in whether or not people should go to jail for killing mosquitoes, okay? Even cruelly killing mosquitoes. I'm not sure that's possible. So today, what we say, most states have come back to the line of invertebrates. So all the cruelty laws will apply when you do the inappropriate act to a vertebrate. Because, as you all are well aware, vertebrates have a centralized nervous system to which we think the word pain would be useful. After you get below vertebrates, certainly in the legislature, there's uncertainty about the usefulness of that word. Now, notice that another thing that's not there is the word maliciously. Okay, so the New York law does not require a showing of maliciousness, i.e. a specific intent crime. You simply, if you torture, we don't care why you tortured. If we think you've tortured, you broke the law. Now, the other interesting thing is that torture, torment, unnecessarily, cruelly, all those terms are not defined. And pretty much remain undefined in the laws of today. I suspect everybody thinks they know what torture means, right? It has a place in your head somewhere. But when you go to argue before a jury, it becomes a little more slippery. What is torture? Is there an intentionality inherent in it? It's certainly an excess of something, right? The thing to remember about this is criminal law. And therefore, the ultimate judge of whether or not a specific act is torture is up to a jury. The prosecutor has to present the evidence and say, you, jury, have to go back and decide, were these acts torture? If they are, convict him. If they're not, he's innocent. And so you get 12 people, 6, who aren't lawyers, who go back and just ponder that word. Thus is our legal criminal law system built. And it works. I think it works pretty well. And notice that, as you may have noticed, a jury never has to explain itself. They don't have to say why they think it's torture. They just are asked the question, is it torture? I also want to show that even outside the United States, we have these fudge factors. This is from Austria. Just happened to have somebody who sent me some law from Austria. Unjustified pain and suffering. That's the same concept that we were talking about here. That's the crime, unjustified. And on this one at the bottom, I didn't focus enough on the fact we have the word unnecessarily or cruelly undefined. Unnecessarily beat. And how do you know what's an unnecessary beating? There's actually a pretty interesting court opinion directly on that point from the 1880s, where somebody was beating his horse. And the judge gave a very thoughtful consideration of how do we sort out what's necessary and unnecessary? Just like you may strike your child, but you can't go too far. You may strike your horse, and you can go farther with a horse than you can with your child, but there's still a point at which you can't proceed without breaking the law. And again, this all goes to a jury. Here's something new, slightly troublesome to me, but it's what I see happening over the past 10 years. All 50 states have been brought up considerably in the last 30 to 40 years, so that the cruelty laws are robust in most states. There's still 10 that aren't, but in most states there's a nice robust set of laws that deal with animals, and with only 2 or 3 exceptions that it deals with animals everywhere. But now we're seeing these special protections for companion animals. This is only for companion animals, so it's not even dogs and cats. It's only if that particular animal is owned by and is a companion to another human. Okay, now we have this class of animals, and if you cause serious injury or death, then it's a much higher misdemeanor or it's a felony. And I guess at one level I'm happy that these animals get the extra protection, or the presumed incentive that people would treat them better because the crime is more serious. But I'm not sure I buy that, because I don't know why this cat that's by my feet should have special status versus the cat that's out there in my barn. To in my mind, they're cats and they both deserve equal level of treatment. But now the law is distinguishing, drawing an artificial line depending upon its relationship to a human, which is sort of going back to where we started, was that those animals that were the property of humans got more protection, except now it's a companion animal. And of course the reason it's there is that they have the political support, right? Everybody's in favor of companion animals. But that sort of thing sort of bothers me. Now we need to go a little bit deeper. We're now in the present time, okay? And what makes, who decides what is a crime and what is not a crime? And I talked about the fact that juries play a factor, but there's more to it than that. What's acceptable, what's unacceptable? Because if we had to give with specificity every act that would be illegal against an animal, it's an infinite list, right? I mean, we've unfortunately seen time and again that people come up with new and bizarre ways to do bad things to animals. So we can't say that we're going to list everything specifically. We have 3 places where people make decisions in the legal system. The legislature, which I think everybody here is pretty familiar with, but we also have administrative and executive law, and we have juries and judicial law. Since we're talking about criminal law, that's, to the extent we talk about criminal law, that is almost entirely in the bailiwick of the legislature. Okay? But there are times when administrative law is interesting. Administrative law is, I think, pretty much what you think about. That is, agencies have the power to adopt regulations to carry out congressional intent. We had in New Jersey a very interesting pattern or situation arise, because the New Jersey legislature wrote a law directing the Department of Agriculture in New Jersey to adopt regulations that would protect for the humane treatment of farm animals. It didn't further define what humane treatment meant. It left it up to the agency. And that was a clear delegation of line drawing to the agency. The agency was to decide what was humane. This practice is legal, this practice is not legal. The agency apparently spent considerable time and effort dealing with that, and you might imagine that the politics of the agency dealing with that in the face of all the farm groups in the state having an interest in not having new regulatory controls put upon them, resulted in, from those of us on the animal side of things, we were not really happy with the outcome, because the regulations pretty much said whatever people are doing now is what will be acceptable. And so there was a big lawsuit over that with national parties involved, and it went to the Supreme Court of New Jersey. And I must say I was very impressed that the Supreme Court of New Jersey took this as a very serious issue. They really got into it. They looked at what the agency had done. They used the judicial standards that you would hope they would use in an agency consideration. And they set aside some of the things the agency did, and they upheld some of the things that the agency did. The one sentence I would give you for administrative decision-making here is that courts inherently and almost always give great deference to an agency. Courts don't second-guess agencies if they're doing it right. And therefore, most of what the agency had set out, the courts upheld. The legislature can decide for itself, or it can send it to the jury. Okay? If the charge is X is then charged with imposing unnecessary suffering, pain and suffering. Okay? That's sending it to the jury. They've given us no specifics by which to judge it. But they could decide specifically, right? And they could say, for example, you cannot remove cat claws. We decide as a matter of social policy that removal of cat claws is inappropriate unless it's for medical reasons, because of pain and suffering to the cat. And some states have done that. Not too many, but some. But in that case, you don't have to go to a jury to find out whether or not the removal of a claw is unnecessary pain and suffering. The legislature makes that. So over time, what you see happening is that more and more specific acts get listed by the legislature because people have found that juries were a little wishy-washy or didn't know what to do, and therefore we want to deal with this specific thing, and so we're going to take it to the legislature and get it listed. We're going to nail that point. Like, how long should a leash be? Well, Michigan says 3 times the length of the dog. It's very specific. You either measure it, it's either there or it's not there. Hey, that's nice. That's easy to enforce. Rather than having a policeman come up and look at this animal on a leash and how does he know if that's the right length or not, you know? So the law is helpful sometimes by providing specifics. Much time. When we draw a line, understand what we're doing. We're balancing the interest of the animal versus the interest of the human. Humans don't want cats destroying their furniture or scratching their children, and therefore they decide that it's the human interest supersedes the cat's interest, and therefore we're going to declaw the cat. That's an issue of ethics as to the individual, unless the state has stepped in and said, no, you can't. So we have dispute over that. I understand we have dispute over that. I'm not suggesting otherwise. But there are also some things that are pretty clear at this point. We have a strong social consensus against dogfighting. It's a felony. You do jail time. Thanks to Michael Vick, the quarterback who had a side job of dogfighting, we had a national discussion about 5 years ago on whether or not dogfighting should be an acceptable use of animals. And I think it was pretty clear the consensus was no, this is unacceptable. You cannot do these to dogs for the human gain. The human gain of money, pride, prestige is insufficient given the pain, suffering, and death that's imposed upon the animals. It's the only time I've been invited to speak on ESPN radio. And they wanted to know, well, about dogfighting. You know, how often is that going to come up on ESPN, right? And anybody that called in, all the people that talked to me, I mean, they were just absolutely, this is a horrible thing. It should not be condoned. You know, the question is which arms they were going to cut off of Michael Vick. Apparently they didn't cut off his throwing arm. He's out there working hard. This is Section number 2 from the 1867 New York law was to deal with animal fighting. Animal fighting was more of an activity back then than it is now, because it literally was entertainment. If you read about Shakespeare and the animal fighting that occurred around the auspices of London, and that the Shakespearean actors often had to shift stages where they performed animal fighting acts, you'll see how far back the roots go in our history. And it seems like many of the cultures that arrived into New York over the 1800s, and even up through more recent times, bring with them animal fighting as part of their culture. Now, doesn't tend to be, well, cockfighting is more of a southern culture than dogfighting, but we have it. So in New York law had that as a prohibition. New York law, just 2 more quick points on that. The other thing that he did that was so amazing was that he got in the law the right of the ASPCA to prosecute the cases criminally. So they could go out, arrest, and prosecute somebody that violated the criminal law and keep the fine. Wow. That's aggressive lawyering. I like that. It was just in the last year that ASPCA has given up the right of investigation. They didn't have the right to prosecute. And the other thing was there was only one exception to the cruelty law in the original New York law. I had somebody ask me, well, what about hunting? No, everybody assumed hunting was fine. Okay, there was no attempt to talk about it. But they did say that these rules about unnecessary pain and suffering would not apply to scientific research. So even in 1867, the use of animals in science was perceived as a social necessity that would be different from the rules that apply to the general public. How would we balance the need? How should the law balance the need of people to go bet money on the pain, suffering, early death, and overbreeding of the race of the dogs that are part of? A fair number of the states have simply outlawed it. What should we think about that? I suspect you as veterinarians are more aware of some of the really negative things that are happening to horses in the racing world these days. I've had a number of students write fairly sophisticated papers pointing out how it's become just a money game. It's become, how do I win the prize? And the concern for the horses seems to be diminished on an increasing basis, to the point that I hear some pretty reputable people saying, you know, can we regulate it? Can we get these negative things out of it, or do we need to shut it down? I would also suggest to you that one of the reasons why this is happening is the system has become so big that the owner is totally separated physically and emotionally from the horse. It used to be you were running your horse, and you'd go out and see the horse, and you had a trainer, you had other, but it was your horse. You wouldn't do stupid things to your horse. How much risk would you take to break the leg of your own horse? But now it's owned by consortiums and groups of people, and you know, they send in money from Saudi Arabia to own a horse. Well, they don't care about the horse. They care about the potential to make money off of the horse. And at that point, the world changes, as far as I'm concerned. You need somebody locally to help with the horse. Of course, then we go farm animal issues. I won't spend time here. You can imagine the questions that are involved there. You probably see as much of this as I do. Is it ethical to keep those hens in those cages? I say absolutely not. What does the law say? Well, the law says those cages are going to go away in a couple of years in the state of Michigan. We passed a law that said those cages are not acceptable. Huge, long phase-in periods, a lot of other issues, but they still going to have cages. We don't require them to be free range. What about zoos? We do have a national law that deals with the condition of animals in zoos. But is that good about private zoos? Remember what happened in Ohio where that guy in the private zoo let the animals loose and committed suicide? New law in Ohio says, no, you can't have those anymore. Chimpanzees in science. The good news, chimpanzees are being phased out of science, not by law, which I find fascinating, but by self-examination. More and more groups within the scientific community they won't say it publicly, but have clearly reached the position that it's unethical to use such complex beings in scientific experiments. And they're seeking now to have all but some very small number transported to rescue centers and lifetime reserves. One thing to keep in mind is that which is that fudge word of unnecessary is time-dependent, socially dependent. What we think is unnecessary was not what they thought in 1867. I had one case in which the judge thought that it was perfectly acceptable to drown a set of kittens in the river in a bag. That would not be cruel and unusual. What are we doing today that in 50 years society is going to judge as unnecessary pain and suffering? I want to leave you with something a little more science-focused, a challenge for you. I do have a science degree, so I know a little bit about what I speak, and that is, I think I understand pain, and I think obviously you all understand pain. The really difficult term is suffering. What is suffering? And I'd like you to go home tonight and write me out 3 sentences about what suffering is. Then come back to it a week later and write it again. I think you might find it a very interesting exercise to sort of begin to peel back what's behind that word. What does that really mean?
Are we supposed to send them to you?
I'd be happy to look at them if you want. So that's my conclusion for today, is to give you a challenge to think about what the word suffering means. Thank you.
Questions?
I'll figure it out. After all that, there won't be any questions.
No, there's a question back.
Hi, what is your take on breed-specific legislation?
Well, let's throw a bomb around and see what happens. My position is that it's not a good idea. That the world is more complex than looking at an animal and saying, you're bad and you're good. I don't believe that pit bulls have inherent negative characteristics so as to be condemned from birth as to what it is. That doesn't mean I don't think we don't have a problem, but just breed-specific legislation is not, the way it's been done so far is not particularly useful. The other thing that always, we talk about it in my animal law class, and I go to the web page that has the 40 dogs on it, and you're to pick out the pit bull, and nobody can do it. They have no idea what a pit bull looks like, and yet we have an enforcement mechanism that says uneducated people walking down the street are going to be able to pick up a dog and say, that's a pit bull. And who knows what a pit bull is sometimes, right? So the fact that it can be randomly enforced is also a sign of a bad law. You should not have laws that do that. Other thoughts, questions? Oh, come on. There we go.
In regards to the companion law, now is that just New York or is that in Michigan as well?
That was just in Illinois.
It was just in Illinois, okay. So, say in the state of Michigan you have to have your dog under your control 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So your dog took off and attacked your neighbor's cat. What is the liability there? Because cats under the state of Michigan do not fall underneath farm animals, poultry, livestock.
Oh, right. We have that special law that deals specifically with dogs attacking farm animals, right?
Correct.
But that doesn't, you still can't attack a cat. But you better not perhaps try to shoot the cat on the premises. That wouldn't be too good at it.
Well, I guess the question I kind of
it's still illegal.
Say you wanted to while that owner was watching their cat be killed by the dog, do they have a right to shoot the dog?
I don't think I can give you an opinion on that. I've never seen a case. I have no idea what the courts would think about it, and I don't like the idea of taking what is clearly stated in law in one area and then applying it to another area where it's not so clearly stated. It can still be a criminal act. They can still be sued for the value of the animal. I mean, it's clearly illegal, but I don't want to go around and say anybody should shoot anything.
When you said that the administrative executive branch, the courts will generally give greater deference to an agency, when you say an agency, are you specifically talking about a government agency like the USDA, or are we talking about ASPCA?
No, government agency, yeah. But as a lawyer, when I use the word agency, it means government created. Otherwise, I'd say nonprofit organization or something like that. I don't consider those agencies.
And then just out of curiosity, what are you a member of any of the animal, what groups are you members of in terms of like the animal rights groups? Or
I'm its founding member and treasurer of the Animal Legal Defense Fund for over 20 years.
Thank you.
I have a question.
The laws seem to discuss cruelty and neglect or abuse, but they don't seem to discuss welfare. So,
Michigan law specifically does do welfare very well. One of the best states in the country is the fact that we have a duty to provide care section. And it defines what that duty to provide care means. And it means water, veterinary care, exercise, a whole bunch of things, which are then further defined as well, so that there's just levels of definitions to make it very clear what one's duty to provide care for the animals they have custody and control over. No, it's really quite extensive.
Does it
include things that go beyond food, shelter, and water? And who is responsible for enforcing those laws?
Well, the police, which is not always useful. I would say that our law does an excellent job of covering the physical welfare of an animal. But there's nothing in our law that deals with mental or social. It simply is the physical. There's no requirement that species be kept with like species or anything like that. But the well-being of the animal to be healthy is specifically provided for. What it doesn't provide for is what if you don't have the money to do that. So it looks like poor people could be criminals for not taking care of the animals the same way that middle-class people do.
Thank you. You made a couple comments near the end of your presentation about, in regards to the horse racing industry. And I guess I would caution you just a bit, if you would, when you make those comments, to not paint all racehorse owners with the same brushstroke, because there are plenty of them that still own and care for and train their horses on their own. And while, yes, making money is an American way, there's nothing wrong with that, don't paint all of them exactly the same way, because your statement's not 100% accurate. Thank you.
Absolutely. I understand that. I think that my problem is I have seen an increasing number of bad things happen to racehorses as the economics of it have ramped up, so as the problems. But you're right, there's thousands of people who take perfectly good care of their horses. But I bet most of them have their horse where they see them and deal with them and interface with them. It's when you lose that connection to the horse from the owners when I think the risk just escalates.
So I have a question about the concept of strict or absolute liability with the owner assuming the responsibility or liability of a non-traditional pet like a bobcat or an exotic pet. That's a concept that I appreciate a little explanation.
Well, it is clear that as a matter of law, an exotic animal bring strict liability. In other words, on our the tort system, that's personal liability. Has for centuries held that if you bring in an animal that that the community is not familiar with, you are strictly liable for whatever that animal does, because nobody else can anticipate what the potential risks are. And then that's followed up in a number of states, not yet entirely in Michigan, by simple prohibitions. You just can't have those animals anymore.
I've always thought it was very strange how apartment complexes and just different areas that you live can reject certain breeds. Have you ever dealt with anything like that, because they never look into your specific animal to see, are they good, bad, whatever, but they just assume if you're this breed, not even just pit bulls, that you can't live here? And how is that even legal to be able to say that to people?
Because they haven't made it illegal. In other words, that's a private contract between two parties. And the position of the law is, until we step in and say that we're going to change something, you can make any arrangement you want. If you want to live in a place where you can have great big tall dogs that weigh 800 pounds, then you just need to find the right landlord. You don't have a right to take that dog anywhere you want. Now, we'll add a couple of layers to that. In California, they did pass a law that said everybody had the right to 2 pets. So in those cases, those contracts had to be modified to allow the tenants to have the pets. The other thing that I see all the time is under the U.S. law for disabilities, the idea of having a companion animal, a pet animal, or a therapy animal, that is now just omnipresent as an issue, because everybody begins to understand, well, I can't have a pet, but I can have an animal, a therapist animal. So I need to recharacterize what my animal is, and then the landlord will have to let me keep it. Because there is some language that requires a landlord to bend when it comes to, the seeing eye dog is the classic example. No landlord can keep out a seeing eye dog.
I just have a quick question. What do you say to people who say, what is the point of having these laws on the book if they're not enforced, if you don't know who to call, or you call who it is that you think you need to call, and it seems like nothing gets done? What do you say to those people?
Well, I don't want the world in which there are no laws, because then I know nothing's going to happen. And as I said before, it is quite normal that laws get passed before they're fully implemented by society. That's just the way our political process works. And I was just talking to a prosecutor up in the upper part of the peninsula last Friday, and I said, he's not an animal person, has nothing to do with animals. He's a prosecutor, 20 years he's been a prosecutor. He said, and I said, well, what do you do about animal cruelty cases? And he says, when one of those comes in my door, I put it on my desk. I want to deal with it because I know how much the public gets riled up about animal issues. So I'm very happy to hear that. I'm smiling, right? The big guy's taking it on because he knows his political consequences if he doesn't take it on. He said that if there's a sex abuse issue with a child, nobody ever shows up. But if there's an abuse of an animal case, horse starving, 50 people show up in the jury to see what happens. So the public can make prosecutors become more and more sensitive. There are places, and apparently rural Texas is one of them, I get this complaint all the time, where the sheriff pretty well decides what the law is, and it just, there's no way to get to it. But for the most part, it's an educational process of the enforcers.
Is it accurate? I've felt when I've talked with people who have been in the situation, whether it's going to be acted on upon or not, you still need to file the complaint, or it never happened. Is that a reason? I mean, the person whose dog was attacked.
You got to shake the system a little bit. You got to do something. You got to get their attention. In really egregious cases, I say, when they've said, they've done that, and I say, well, you got 2 other maps ahead of you. One is political, and the other is PR. Find a newspaper that might want to take this story on. That'll get things riled up. Talk to your elected official of the locality in which you live and ask them, why aren't the police doing this? Can you hold the police chief accountable for what's happening? Well, an example of where some good things have happened is one of the sadder areas about the law I deal with is police shooting pets. It used to happen and nobody even could say anything about it. Then people started to say about it. We found a legal leverage to try to hold some people accountable for the unnecessary shooting of pets. And what has happened is that even though there's troubles bringing a lawsuit, the PR that comes out of that usually is sufficient to go through the mayor or somebody else to go to the police chief, and then the Humane Society of the United States or somebody comes and says, we need to train your officers. Okay, we can't help what happened that one time, but this shouldn't happen again. And we need to train you. So change comes through all sorts of people pushing.
Thank you, David. And I'd also like to give a push to the website. I found it to be excellent and very useful. And so if you're interested in animal law at all, it is a place where everything is. I think we have a 15-minute break, right? Yes. Okay.